Before diving into this unsettling story, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other true and disturbing accounts like this one. Turn on notifications to receive updates on future stories as soon as they are published. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Does your city or country also hold mysteries that have never been revealed? The house stood on North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas, an ordinary building at first glance. Like so many others erected in the late 19th century, light wood, symmetrical windows, a small front porch. Nothing about it seemed menacing when viewed in daylight, yet there was something that couldn't be explained simply by the age of the structure. Something manifested itself in the way the air seemed denser around the house, as if the silence there carried weight. When Matthew and Deborah Pickman decided to move to the place, they weren't looking for mystery or history. He was a practical man, skeptical by nature, a civil servant accustomed to dealing with concrete facts. Deborah, more sensitive, saw in the old house only charm and economy. The rent was affordable, the neighborhood quiet, and the small town offered exactly the kind of anonymity they both desired at that point in their lives. The conflict didn't begin with shouts, nor with shadows moving. It began in an almost banal way. In the first week, Matthew woke up with the uneasy feeling of being watched. There was no noise, just the physical certainty that he wasn't alone in the room. When he turned on the light, he found only motionless furniture and silent walls. He attributed it to tiredness, overtime at work, a recent move, and adjusting to the new space. Deborah began noticing inexplicable marks on the house. Scratches appeared on the interior doors, thin and deep, as if something had been pulled forcefully against the wood. Neither of them owned pets. The marks weren't there the day before. Still, they avoided jumping to conclusions. The real break from normality occurred in the basement. It was a cramped space, with uneven stone walls and a constant smell of dampness. The old staircase creaked under any weight, and the dim lighting barely reached the corners. Deborah avoided the place, overcome by a physical feeling of unease whenever she went down. Nausea, dizziness, a strange pressure in her chest. Matthew, bothered by his wife's reaction, began to go down alone, determined to prove that there was nothing there but old foundations and worn-out pipes. It was there that he first felt a sharp, sudden pain in his arm, as if something invisible had scratched his skin. The wound appeared before his eyes, red, inflamed lines too deep to ignore. There were no exposed nails, nor any sharp surfaces nearby. The house was starting to react. At night, footsteps echoed upstairs when they were both downstairs. Objects moved from their places, doors opened by themselves, always with enough force to rule out any explanation based on drafts. The living room clock stopped repeatedly at 3:17 a.m. Deborah began to hear a child's voice. It wasn't constant. It would emerge as a distant whisper, drawing out her name. At times it seemed like a cry for help, at others, an order. With each manifestation, the ambient temperature would drop abruptly, as if heat were being drained from the space. Matthew resisted. He noted the times, looked for patterns, examined every rational possibility. But his resolve began to crumble when he woke up one morning with marks on his chest, deeper than before, accompanied by a pain that persisted for days. The feeling of being attacked while sleeping could no longer be ignored. Tension between the couple was rising. Deborah wanted to leave immediately. Matthew, torn between growing fear and wounded pride, insisted on understanding what was happening before making any decisions. The house seemed to react to this discord, intensifying its manifestations whenever they argued. As the weeks passed, old stories emerged. Locals spoke of a girl named Sallie, supposedly killed there after a brutal medical procedure in the 19th century. There were no clear official records, only orally transmitted accounts, distorted by time. Some said the spirit was just a lost child. Others claimed that something much older occupied the space, using the girl's image as a disguise. Doubt became as oppressive as fear. What really inhabited that house? Each night seemed to bring them closer to an answer neither of them was prepared to face. Sallie House didn't just hold a dark past. It seemed to demand attention, a reaction, a confrontation, as if something there refused to remain forgotten. And what was most disturbing was not the violence of the demonstrations, but the growing feeling that the establishment was choosing sides. Atchison was the kind of town where the past never truly disappeared. The narrow streets, the old buildings, preserved more out of habit than intention, and the way the residents spoke of yesterday, as if it were still lurking, created an atmosphere of permanence. Nothing there seemed truly new. Everything simply continued. Sallie House fit perfectly into this context. Built at the end of the 19th century, it bore the marks of successive, poorly documented renovations. Walls closed off without explanation, doors leading to unused spaces, a basement that seemed deeper than the size of the house allowed. The architecture didn't follow a clear logic. It was as if the space had been adapted repeatedly to accommodate needs that no one remembered anymore. Deborah began to realize that the house reacted differently to each of them. With her, the atmosphere took on an oppressive, overly silent character. The whispers arose mainly when she was alone, always accompanied by a heavy, almost suffocating feeling of sadness. There was no direct aggression, but a constant discomfort, as if something demanded her attention. With Matthew, the approach was different, physical, hostile. The marks on his body appeared without warning, always during moments of resistance or explicit disbelief. When he verbalized that it was all just a coincidence, the response came quickly. Objects thrown, violent blows against the walls, deep scratches that burned for hours. This difference in treatment began to shape the couple's behavior. Deborah became more cautious, avoiding certain rooms, respecting implicit schedules that she seemed to learn instinctively. Matthew, on the other hand, began to test limits, as if challenging the house was the only way to regain some control over his own life. The neighbors watched from a distance. Some avoided direct contact, others offered vague advice, always tinged with ambiguity. An elderly lady from the street behind commented casually that that house was never empty for long. She didn't explain why. She just smiled, as if the answer were too obvious to say. While investigating local records, Matthew found perplexing gaps. There was no clear documentation of a child's death in the house. No death certificate, no medical report. Only scattered accounts of a doctor who treated children there in the late 19th century. Improvised surgeries, performed without proper anesthesia, were common at the time. The line between healing and torture was thin. The name Sallie appeared only in personal diaries and stories passed down orally. In some versions, the girl died during an appendectomy. In others, she was just a frequent patient who never left. The inconsistency of the accounts raised a disturbing question. If Sallie really existed, why was her story so fragmented? The house seemed to feed off this uncertainty. The manifestations became more specific. Children's drawings appeared in the basement, scratched directly onto the stone wall. Deformed human figures, eyes too large, mouths open in undefined expressions. None of them resembled something made by an ordinary child. There was a strange intention in those forms. Deborah began experiencing constant physical changes, extreme fatigue, persistent headaches, and difficulty sleeping. In contrast, Matthew showed clear signs of emotional exhaustion, irritability, memory lapses, and a constant feeling of being provoked. The house not only manifested itself, it seemed to study it. The tension between the couple grew silently. There were no major arguments, just a gradual distancing. Each dealt with the phenomenon in isolation, as if sharing experiences only made everything more real. Sallie House explored this distancing, intensifying events when they were apart, and downplaying them when they were together, as if testing the strength of their bond. The world around them remained indifferent. The city went about its routine, ignoring what was unfolding inside that old structure. But inside the house, something was taking shape. It wasn't chaos, it was method. And the more the Pickmans tried to understand what they were facing, the clearer it became that it wasn't just a spirit trapped in the past. There was an active consciousness there, shaped by pain, abandonment, and something deeper. Something that didn't entirely belong to human history. The escalation of events did not follow a linear pattern. It was as if Sallie House had abandoned the observation phase and initiated a direct confrontation. Small, isolated events gave way to linked sequences, where each action of the couple produced an almost immediate reaction. Matthew began to document everything with obsessive rigor. Times, locations, weather conditions, emotional state before and after each occurrence. The intention was to create control through logic. However, the more he organized the data, the more evident the absence of coherent explanations became. The manifestations did not follow natural cycles, nor coincide with external factors. They responded to attitudes. One night, after declaring aloud that nothing there could truly hurt him, Matthew felt a violent pressure on his chest that threw him against the hallway wall. There was no warning, no prior noise, just impact, followed by difficulty breathing. The marks appeared minutes later, deep, inflamed lines, as if invisible hands had dug into his skin. Deborah witnessed the scene without being able to intervene. The feeling of powerlessness was immediate. For the first time, the house seemed indifferent to her presence, focusing exclusively on him. The atmosphere grew abruptly cold, and the lighting flickered for seconds that seemed far too long. When it all ceased, the silence returned with an almost oppressive density. From that episode onward, the dynamic changed. The house began to isolate Matthew. Doors closed between him and Deborah. The basement became inaccessible to her, while he was drawn there by persistent noises. Dry knocks, rhythmic scratching, sounds reminiscent of short, hurried footsteps. Whenever he went down, he felt a mixture of anger and urgency, as if he were being challenged. In the basement, the drawings had multiplied. The figures became more aggressive, with overlapping lines, scratched with enough force to chip the stone. Among them, words emerged irregularly. Play, pain, stay. No signature, no explanation. Deborah, in turn, began to experience more subtle yet constant manifestations. Personal objects disappeared and reappeared in improbable places. Family photographs were moved, always with faces partially obscured by shadows projected in an impossible way. The child's whisper became clearer, less distant. It wasn't asking for help, it was calling out. Emotional tension affected even simple decisions. Sleeping in the same room became rare. The house seemed to react to this separation with more intense events, as if the distance between them were an incentive. Whenever they tried to get closer again, the manifestations temporarily diminished, only to return with greater force afterward. A local paranormal researcher was invited to visit the house. His presence brought about an immediate change in the atmosphere. Equipment malfunctioned, batteries discharged without explanation, and temperature sensors registered abrupt drops in specific points of the basement. He reported feeling a hostile presence, something that did not behave like a typical childlike entity. Before leaving, he made a disturbing observation. The house wasn't just occupied, it was active. After that visit, the physical attacks against Matthew intensified. The marks became deeper, accompanied by a constant feeling of extreme fatigue. Deborah began to have recurring nightmares, always involving a child watching from a distance, motionless, while something larger remained hidden in the shadows. The conflict ceased to be merely external. Matthew began to exhibit behavioral changes, outbursts of anger without apparent cause, unremembered lapses in time, impulsive decisions. The house seemed to encourage his most aggressive impulses, as if it fed on his reaction. Deborah realized that fear wasn't the only tool being used. There was emotional manipulation. The entity, or entities, seemed to understand human frailties and exploit them with unsettling precision. The goal wasn't just to frighten, but to inflict continuous wear and tear. Each attempt at resistance resulted in a more elaborate response. Sallie House didn't repeat attacks. It evolved, it adapted, and the more the Pickmans tried to confront it as an isolated phenomenon, the clearer it became that the conflict had become personal. The house didn't just want to be recognized, she wanted to be obeyed. As time passed, it became impossible to separate the main phenomenon from the small parallel stories that began to emerge around Sallie House. Each seemingly secondary detail revealed itself to be connected to something larger, forming a silent web of cause and effect. One of these subplots emerged from former residents. Matthew managed to locate fragmented records of families who had lived in the house over the decades. None had stayed for very long. The accounts varied in intensity, but there were unsettling patterns, unexplained illnesses, domestic conflicts that abruptly escalated, episodes of violence that did not exist before the move. A couple from the 1950s mentioned a presence that encouraged discord. A family from the 1970s reported that the father had become progressively aggressive, culminating in a traumatic separation. In none of these cases was there direct mention of a child. The focus always fell on increasing tension and altered behaviors. This contradicted the popular narrative of a lonely child spirit. As Matthew delved deeper into this investigation, Deborah developed an involuntary relationship with the house, not one of acceptance, but of perception. She began to notice subtle patterns in the moments of manifestation, specific times, distinct reactions to certain objects, greater activity when negative emotions dominated the environment. The house seemed to amplify human feelings as if they functioned as fuel. A new layer of complexity emerged when Deborah found a hidden compartment behind a false wall in the basement. The space was cramped, almost claustrophobic, containing old objects, rudimentary medical instruments, broken bottles, fabrics hardened by time. Nothing indicated recent use, but the feeling of presence was immediate. The discovery coincided with a sudden change in the behavior of the manifestations. The whispers ceased for a short period, replaced by absolute silence. In contrast, physical activity became more organized. Doors closed in sequence. Knocks arose at regular intervals like a code. Matthew interpreted the find as historical evidence. Deborah as a warning. Another subplot began to unfold outside the house. The neighborhood, previously distant, began to show excessive interest. Prolonged stares, indirect questions, vague comments about things that don't like to be disturbed. It became clear that Sallie House was not just a problematic address, it was a sensitive point in the city's collective memory. Time pressure intensified when Matthew began exhibiting more severe physical symptoms. Bruises appeared without apparent cause, accompanied by a persistent low-grade fever. Doctors found no concrete explanation. The emotional strain worsened the situation, creating a difficult cycle to break. Deborah realized that the phenomenon reacted differently whenever they tried to leave the house for extended periods. Returns were followed by more violent manifestations, as if the absence was interpreted as rejection. This raised a disturbing possibility. The entity might be linked not only to the physical space, but to human presence. The subplots converged toward an unsettling conclusion. Sallie House didn't tell a single story, but many, overlapping and distorted by time. The figure of the girl seemed to function as a focal point, something that made the horror more acceptable, easier to explain. However, the collected data pointed to something more complex, perhaps older, that adapted to human narratives to remain active. The biggest internal conflict arose when Deborah began to question whether the house truly wanted to hurt them, or if it was seeking something specific from Matthew. The targeted attacks, the focus on their reactions, the escalation always linked to resistance, suggested selective intent. The complexity increased as the subplots intertwined. Nothing there was isolated. Each previous story, each hidden object, each emotional reaction seemed to feed into a larger, silent and conscious system, and time now was not on their side. The breaking point didn't come with immediate violence. It came with clarity. After the discovery of the hidden compartment in the basement, the house fell into an unnatural state of quiet. There were no whispers, knocks, or perceptible movements. The silence, however, brought no relief. It seemed calculated, like a strategic pause before something bigger. Matthew interpreted the calm as a sign that the phenomenon was weakening. Deborah, on the other hand, felt that something was being prepared. The change occurred one early morning when Matthew woke up without knowing how he had gotten to the basement. He sat on the cold floor, leaning against the stone wall, his hands stained with dust and bearing small, recent cuts. He felt no immediate pain, only intense confusion. The clock read 3:17 a.m., the same recurring time since the beginning of the events. As he tried to stand, he noticed deep marks on his forearm, more extensive than any he had seen before. But for the first time, something was different. The marks didn't look like attacks, they were symbols. Curved and crisscrossing lines formed a repetitive pattern, similar to the drawings found on the walls. Next to them, a word had been irregularly scratched: "Stay." When Deborah found him, she felt such an intense wave of cold that she had to lean on the stairs. The surroundings seemed to react to her presence, as if the house had been awaiting this witness. The lights flickered briefly and the air became heavy, almost impossible to breathe. It was then that Deborah had her first complete insight. This was not a child trying to communicate. The old accounts, the fragmented stories, the figure of Sallie, all of this functioned as a superficial layer, an acceptable face for something that needed to be humanized to persist. The entity wasn't bound to the identity of a girl. It used it. The revelation solidified when Deborah found, among the old objects in the hidden compartment, a deteriorated medical notebook. The pages, almost illegible, described repeated procedures performed on different children over the years. The name Sallie appeared as a generic reference, not as an individual identity. It was a label. The house had been a place of informal medical practice, where pain and fear were constant. The energy accumulated there did not belong to a single victim, but to a collection of extreme experiences. What was manifesting now was the result of this, a consciousness shaped by collective suffering, which had learned to survive through human interaction, and Matthew was the anchor point. The entity reacted to his resistance because it needed to break it, not to kill him, but to keep him. Each challenge strengthened the bond. Each attempt at control deepened the connection. The aggressions were not punishments, but tools for shaping. When Deborah tried to verbalize this understanding, the house responded immediately. The basement doors slammed shut, isolating them. The floor vibrated slightly, as if something were moving within the walls. For the first time, there was no physical attack, just an overwhelming pressure, a feeling of absolute presence. Matthew felt something shift inside him. Not fear, recognition. Fragments of memories that didn't belong to him began to surface. Intense pain, muffled voices, hands gripping tightly. The entity wasn't just manifesting around him, it was sharing experiences, inserting memories. The final revelation was silent but devastating. The house wasn't trying to evict them. It never had been. She was trying to secure her stay. Sallie wasn't a spirit that refused to leave. She was a mask constructed from many voices, used to attract, confuse, and keep humans close. And now, with Matthew deeply connected, the house had achieved something it had never had before: conscious continuity. Nothing would ever be the same again. After the night in the basement, the house ceased acting overtly. There were no new immediate physical attacks, no whispers, no sudden movements. Instead, a constant, almost intimate presence settled in. as if the entire space were in a state of permanent vigilance. Matthew would wake up with a sense of continuity, as if sleep no longer represented a real pause. Small fragments of memories that weren't his own surfaced throughout the day. The cold texture of the stone under his skin, the metallic smell of old instruments, the diffuse anxiety before something painful happened. These perceptions didn't come as complete visions, but as fleeting sensations, difficult to isolate or explain. Deborah reacted in the opposite way. She became more alert, more practical. The revelation had shifted her raw fear into a state of rational urgency. If the house needed to be permanent, then every decision made within it carried strategic weight. She began to avoid direct confrontations, reducing intense emotional stimuli and maintaining the most stable routine possible. Sallie House responded by adjusting its approach. Instead of violence, subtle interferences emerged. Doors that opened at exactly the right moment, objects placed in a functional way, as if the house were cooperating. It was a new behavior, unsettling because of its artificial normality. The entities seemed to be testing coexistence. Matthew began to notice changes in his own reactions. Situations that would have previously made him uneasy were now met with indifference. The house no longer seemed strange. On the contrary, external environments began to cause discomfort. When leaving for work, he felt a growing anxiety, as if he were distancing himself from something essential. This reversal alarmed Deborah. Their relationship quickly deteriorated. There were no more open discussions, only a silent distance, heavy with unspoken concern. Matthew avoided talking about his inner experiences. When he did, his words were vague, imprecise, as if he lacked the vocabulary to describe what he felt. The entity exploited this change. Whenever Deborah tried to convince him to stay away from the house for longer, subtle events occurred, sudden headaches, memory lapses, a feeling of loss that was difficult to explain. There was no direct aggression, just enough discomfort to reinforce his desire to stay. The city, for its part, seemed indifferent or deliberately distant. Attempts to seek help were met with polite skepticism. Some acquaintances suggested that stress was affecting the couple. Others avoided the subject altogether. Sallie House remained outside the public discourse, as if it were a tacitly forbidden topic. Deborah began to realize that the entity no longer needed to impose itself. The bond with Matthew was already established. The consequences of the turning point were not immediate destruction, but gradual transformation. The house didn't take over, it integrated. Matthew's behavior began to reflect this. He performed household chores with excessive precision, rearranging spaces in an almost ritualistic way. Small structural changes arose without conscious planning. A nail here, a shelf there, adjustments that seemed to align the house with something internal. Deborah's emotional reaction oscillated between fear and determination. She understood now that leaving wouldn't just be a logistical decision. It would involve breaking a bond that wasn't merely physical, but psychological. Perhaps something deeper. The most unsettling consequence was the absence of an immediate climax. There was no explosion of events, nor partial resolution, only the unsettling certainty that the house had reached a new stage. Sallie House no longer needed to prove its presence. She was already one of them. The change didn't happen as a sudden break, but as a slow and deliberate detour. Deborah understood before Matthew that resisting Sallie House required a different kind of strength. Direct confrontation only reinforced the bond. Explicit fear fueled the presence. The only possible way out seemed to be internal reconstruction, silent, strategic, almost invisible. She started by herself. Deborah altered simple but significant habits. She started sleeping at regular times, maintained strict routines, and avoided emotional outbursts. It wasn't denial. It was control. Each conscious gesture seemed to slightly reduce environmental pressure, as if the house lost access to something essential when it didn't find instability to explore. Matthew, however, was fighting on another front. His growth was neither immediate nor conscious. The connection to the house was still deep, but it began to show cracks. Small moments of lucidity would emerge, usually outside of it. During long walks, far from North 2nd Street, he felt a temporary clarity, a sense of identity that wasn't accompanied by constant presence. These moments were brief, but real. Deborah noticed this and began to encourage them without naming the reason. She didn't talk about running away or breaking up. She simply created opportunities, simple invitations, short trips, outdoor tasks. The household reacted subtly, but not aggressively, as if it were assessing the risk of interfering too much. Matthew's growth first manifested itself in his body. The marks stopped appearing. The pain lessened. The constant tiredness gave way to a common human exhaustion without the previous oppressive burden. In parallel, something new emerged: guilt. Not for something he had done, but for something he found difficult to let go of. This guilt indicated awareness. Sallie House began testing boundaries again, but in a different way. No more direct attacks or manipulations, but rather attempts at emotional seduction. Environments became too comfortable. The silence, once heavy, was now welcoming. The house offered stability in exchange for permanence. It was at this point that real growth took hold. Matthew began to recognize these offers, not as threats, but as choices. For the first time since the beginning, he realized that his resistance didn't need to be violent. He simply had to refuse. Small decisions began to accumulate, leaving a room untouched, refusing to rearrange spaces, interrupting unconscious rituals. Each refusal weakened something invisible. The transformation didn't make him stronger in the traditional sense. It made him more present, more self-aware. The entity could no longer act through automatic impulses. It needed to provoke deliberate responses, and that cost energy. Observing this change, Deborah began to act more decisively. She initiated concrete exit plans, though not immediate ones. She organized documents, researched options, and spoke with a few trusted people. All without announcing it, without creating open tension. The household seemed less reactive when not directly challenged. Overcoming in that context was not about victory, it was about regaining autonomy. The couple's growth didn't bring them closer romantically, it brought them closer strategically. They became silent allies, united not by emotion but by purpose. Every step taken outside the influence of the home was an affirmation of identity. Sallie House was still there, watching, present, but he no longer controlled every move. And this change, though subtle, was dangerous for something that depended on human permanence to exist. The preparation did not take the form of an explicit plan. There were no meetings, lists, or declarations of intent. Everything happened through discrete actions, accumulated over days, that seemed too ordinary to carry so much weight. Deborah began the process of detaching herself from material possessions. Personal items started disappearing from the house, removed in small quantities, always irregularly, nothing that immediately caught her attention, nothing that suggested abandonment. Sallie House seemed to tolerate these absences, perhaps interpreting them as natural reorganization. Matthew, in turn, began to experience a more intense internal conflict. Each step toward the final exit was accompanied by a silent emotional resistance. There was no pain, no explicit fear, just the persistent feeling of leaving something unfinished. The entity exploited this feeling, intensifying the atmosphere of belonging whenever it perceived hesitation. The environment reacted in a calculated way. Doors remained open longer. The temperature stayed stable. No disruptive events occurred. It was a dangerous calm, constructed to reduce urgency, to transform stillness into a comfortable choice. Tensions rose when Deborah decided to set a concrete deadline. She didn't say it verbally or write it down. She simply fixed the date internally. From that moment on, the house began to experience minor disruptions, small delays, forgotten items, external commitments that became difficult to keep. Nothing serious, but enough to fragment decisions. Matthew began to feel the return of old sensations, not as attacks, but as induced memories. Fragments of collective pain surfaced in moments of doubt, reinforcing the idea of responsibility. The entity did not threaten, it convinced. It was then that a subplot found quiet resolution. The old records, previously fragmented, began to make sense within a broader logic. Sallie House didn't destroy its inhabitants, it kept them. Those who left early did so before complete integration. Those who stayed longer left marks, psychological, emotional, that stayed with them forever. This understanding made the decision more difficult, but also clearer. The preparation for the climax did not involve confronting the entity directly. It involved denying what it offered: false stability, conditional belonging, diluted identity. Each gesture of autonomy was a rehearsal for the final rupture. The house began to react more noticeably when it perceived the convergence of these actions. Not with violence, but with an amplified presence. The silence deepened, the air grew thicker. The feeling of constant observation returned, now undisguised. Matthew had a defining moment on a seemingly ordinary night. Entering the basement for the last time, he wasn't drawn by noises or curiosity. It was a conscious choice. There, surrounded by the marks and symbols, he realized something essential. The entity couldn't force him. It could only wait for him to stay. That realization was the final trigger. As she climbed the stairs, she felt an unusual clarity. It wasn't heroic courage nor immediate liberation. It was acceptance of loss. The house wouldn't be conquered, just left behind. The preparation was complete. The next step would be irreversible. The last night was marked by no obvious omens. There were no storms, power outages, or classic signs of rupture. Sallie House remained too silent, as if certain of its victory. For Matthew, this absence of conflict was more disturbing than any previous attack. The decision had already been made. There was no doubt left, only execution. Deborah finished closing the last box before dawn. The plan was simple. Leave without ceremony, without goodbyes, without rituals. Remain in the house for the shortest time possible that day. The strategy was to deny meaning to the act, to make the departure banal. The house responded with surgical precision. When Matthew went downstairs to retrieve the last items, the basement door slammed shut behind him, not violently, but with absolute firmness. The sound of the latch echoed definitively. The atmosphere cooled abruptly, and the air took on an almost liquid density. For the first time, the organization has made a full statement. There was no defined form, nor a clear image. The presence occupied the entire space, compressing it. Multiple sensations arose simultaneously: ancient pain, childhood fear, contained anger, prolonged abandonment. They were not individual emotions. They were overlapping layers, experienced by many, projected onto it. The turning point happened there. The entity did not attempt to harm him. He offered him full-time residency. The shared memories intensified, promising relief from pain, absolute belonging, and the dissolution of inner conflict. Matthew realized that this was the real trap. Not violence, but integration, becoming part of the system that kept the house alive. The climax wasn't physical, it was internal. For the first time, Matthew didn't react emotionally. He didn't fight, he didn't beg, he didn't confront. He acknowledged the offer and refused it, not with words, but with a lack of response. He withdrew mentally, focusing on an identity constructed outside of that place. Fragmented, imperfect, human. The house reacted immediately. The pressure increased, not as punishment, but out of desperation. The bond was about to break, and the entity had no means to force it. Deborah, outside, felt the change. The silence was broken by a dry crack, followed by a vibration that ran through the entire structure. She didn't go in, she didn't call, she waited. Inside the basement, Matthew felt something fragmenting. The collective sensations lost their cohesion. The entity, deprived of emotional reaction, began to dissipate. It didn't disappear, it receded. The door opened by itself. Matthew climbed the stairs without looking back. There were no new marks on his body, no pain, just real, physical, human exhaustion. As he crossed the threshold of the front door, he felt an abrupt shift, as if something had been left incomplete. Not in him, but in the house. Sallie House was not destroyed. She stayed. But he lost something essential, the conscious continuity he had almost achieved. The climax was not the defeat of evil, but the definitive refusal to feed it. Leaving Sallie House didn't bring immediate relief. The world beyond North 2nd Street seemed overwhelmingly vast, almost indifferent, as if nothing that had happened had any weight outside that perimeter. For Matthew, the absence of constant presence was felt more as emptiness than liberation. The first few days away from home were marked by subtle adjustments. Sleep returned irregularly, interrupted by fragmented dreams that no longer possessed coherence. There were no more intrusive memories, only emotional remnants difficult to classify. The entity had not followed them. Still, something had been left behind, not as a loss, but as an incomplete closure. Deborah adapted more quickly. The physical distance restored her emotional clarity. The feeling of constant surveillance disappeared, allowing for simple decisions without strategic weight. However, she understood that the experience could not be completely forgotten. Sallie House had shaped choices, revealed limits, imposed a specific form of growth. Matthew faced a slower process. The transformation that occurred at the climax didn't make him invulnerable, only aware. He became more able to recognize patterns of emotional manipulation, both internal and external. The house had unintentionally taught him the cost of passive acceptance. Their relationship did not revert to its previous state, nor did it break down. It became more functional, less idealized. They shared an experience that did not require constant explanation. The silence, once oppressive, was now neutral. Sallie House continued to exist, occupied again after some time. New residents, new narratives, new interpretations. The figure of the girl remained in local stories, adapted, softened, made palatable. Few mentioned what truly underpinned the phenomenon. The mask was easier to accept. For Matthew and Deborah, closure didn't bring definitive answers. There was no concrete proof, no external validation. What remained was the certainty that some presences don't need to be fought, only deprived of what sustains them. The house was not defeated, it was deliberately ignored. And that, for something that depends on human survival, was the closest thing to an end possible. Years later, Matthew drove past Atchison without intending to stop. As he slowed down at the traffic light near North 2nd Street, he avoided looking directly at the house. He felt neither fear nor attraction, just distant recognition. Sallie House remained intact, with new windows and fresh paint. Life seemed normal on the outside. That night, far away, Matthew woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. No presence, no pain. Just the quiet certainty that some stories don't end, they just learn to wait. Stories like that of Sallie House make us question the extent of a place's influence on its inhabitants. Not all evil manifests itself through violence. Sometimes it simply waits for someone to stay too long. If you were in their shoes, would you have left when the first signs appeared, or would you have tried to understand until the end? Tell us in the comments what you would do if faced with something you don't want to hurt, something that just wants to stay. If this story has captivated you this far, share it with someone who is also interested in true mysteries, and continue exploring accounts that challenge what we believe to be safe.